Man, this script was a hard one to do. For as much as I love this game, and as much as I wanted to say, it's really difficult to put it all together in a cohesive package. My first draft would have ended up being over an hour and a half long easily, which just wouldn't fly. My second try cut a lot of that out, but still would have likely been over an hour. I've rewritten this in several different ways, contextualizing the whole thing through many different themes. I've tried explaining the whole story and stepping in when important critiques and thoughts were relevant. I've tried avoiding spoilers so that the review could be useful for people who haven't played the game. I tried focusing on the theme of theater, since it's a vital and underappreciated part of the way the story is written. Everything I did in the end felt too formulaic, or was so long that nobody could ever sit through it. I'd love to talk forever about this, and break absolutely everything down, but that's just not possible. So instead, I'm going to attempt to just touch on the things that I felt did and didn't work, giving the correct context for any of them that need it. I'll break it down into acts like a play, in order to continue with that theme to some small extent, and corral certain groups of ideas together into a somewhat coherent package. As such, this video also expects that you've played the game already, and there will be spoilers abound. So without further ado, here's my in-depth look at Final Fantasy IX. I Want to Be Your Canary. Let's try to start at the beginning, and work our way through the game from there. First of all, this was the first Final Fantasy that was actually released when I was interested in the series. Though I played 7 before this, it had been out for several years already. 9 was likely the first game that I ever anxiously waited for the release of, and got on release day. I then had to wait for several hours to play it while we drove back home from my grandparents' house where we'd been visiting. It goes without saying, but I knew the manual back to front by the time the drive was over. When I popped Disc 1 in for the first time, I was immediately floored by the pre-rendered cutscenes, which still look great today actually, if a bit grainy. The stylization of the game's characters and environments definitely helped to keep things looking good, because our minds don't expect characters that look realistic. So the smooth skin, thick locks of hair, and strange proportions look cartoony rather than grotesque and horrifying like a lot of PS1 CG. Keep in mind that I don't even think I'd ever seen a Final Fantasy older than 7 before then, so the concept of black mages, dedicated summoners, and a high fantasy setting were brand new to me in the series. I didn't come in expecting that at all, though unlike a lot of people who played 7 and 8 as their first Final Fantasies, I was by no means against it. I was just happy to be getting another game that gave me tons of story that I could dive into, and enough content that it felt like I would never run out. I don't remember why, but I didn't have school that week or something, so I played Final Fantasy IX constantly for the next few days. On that first file, and probably a few others while I was younger, I did what apparently a lot of people did back then, and named the characters after me, my friends, and probably named Garnet after some girl in school that I liked. I got all the way to Gizmaluke's grotto the first day that I had it, though I was dangerously underleveled. I also had a friend from the town I'd recently moved from come to sleep over on the day that I got the game. After showing him some cool Game Shark codes on 7, and getting him interested in the series, I proceeded to play Final Fantasy IX for hours, refusing to let him play because I wanted to experience all of the story bits myself. Too bad I didn't know the game had a multiplayer function. He was a bit angry when he left. While playing, I couldn't help but notice how smooth the controls were compared to 7, with the game actually supporting analog input. Tilting the stick just a bit caused the character to walk, and tilting it further made him run, and the movement was no longer gated into 8 directions, which made everything feel precise. Your characters rarely get stuck on objects in 9 because things are so smooth. I was also happy that hidden treasures and such were now marked by an exclamation point that appears above Zidane's head, which, by the way, I might mispronounce some names as we go on. I've said the names certain ways since I was a young kid, and it's kind of hard to break those habits, so I apologize if you hear me say something like Zidane instead of Zidane. I don't know if I'm going to be able to catch them all. Anyway, the exclamation points. They don't by any means make it so that you don't have to hug the walls of each screen searching for treasure. Oh boy, you definitely do. But at least this time you don't have to mash the confirm button while doing so, and you can be fairly certain when you've cleared a screen of treasures. The great thing is that all of these changes are shown to you without a word of explanation from the moment you first gain control of Zidane. The whole intro sequence to this game is honestly just fantastic. You're given a glimpse of the broader story being told, and you're introduced to each of the 4 characters in a way that feels natural and helps identify them. And the amount of character these people have. They easily have some of the strongest writing in the entire series. Everyone in the cast feels so diverse without being a hollow trope intended to fill a gap in the roster. Even Quina as a comic relief character is written really smoothly and has some clever as hell moments and lines. The actual dialogue is incredibly smooth, and the use of dialects to further differentiate characters is extremely well done. It doesn't feel forced. So, your introduction to combat in this game is probably pretty tame if you've ever played a JRPG before. You've got menus of abilities to siphon through, a timer bar that has to fill up before you can take action, and everyone takes turns attacking. Though I didn't know it at the time when I first played the game, 9 takes things back to the old school territory. The parties can once again consist of 4 characters at once, and everyone has their own job to stick to. Abilities, stats, and equipment are dictated by their job, so it's important to pick the right characters for the job. There's one point in particular later on where this becomes essential unless you're greatly overleveled. The game doesn't completely abandon newer mechanics though. Trance is similar to limit breaks from 7 and 8. They're also an important part of the story this time. Trance occurs when a person reaches their emotional limits. In-game, this is shown by a red bar under the ATB gauge that slowly fills as the character takes damage. When the bar fills up, the character has around 3 or 4 turns where their stats are raised, and they often have access to unique abilities. The biggest problem with the trance system is that there's no way to save trances. All too often, your character will reach their limits during your average random battle, leading to it being entirely wasted. There's really only one character that benefits from this, and it's Quina. Quina's the blue mage of the group, meaning she can learn skills from enemies. Being part of the Q race, this possibly asexual character is obsessed with eating things in the hopes of becoming a master gourmand. So naturally, you learn enemy skills by eating them, but they have to have less than 1/8 their maximum health for the eat command to work. Luckily, when Quina trances, eat turns into cook, allowing you to devour any enemy that has less than 1/4 of their maximum health instead. This is really the only time you benefit from trancing during a normal fight, as most enemy mobs can be taken out extremely easily. They're usually fodder created to level you up for the next boss fight. The first disc of Final Fantasy IX is a real marvel in pacing, and it paints an extremely cohesive picture of the world you're exploring. There are so many hidden context clues and things that expand on Gaia and its people. You can find signs, notes, and tons of other things that just drip great writing and world building. I rarely felt that the townspeople just spouted nonsense in this game, which I definitely can't really say about a lot of other JRPGs. What's more, 9 introduces a new mechanic called the Active Time Event System. This allows you to take a look at what's happening elsewhere in the world while you're playing. A lot of the time these are really hilarious or really endearing, and they're always interesting. The game doesn't like to show you things that aren't worth your time. One of the most overlooked aspects of the first disc and the second disc is the parallels they draw to the play Tantalus puts on when they first attempt to capture the princess. While not really the same events, the things that happen during I Want to Be Your Canary are very similar in theme to those experienced during the first 2 discs of the game. There are even characters like Kuja, who has his master plan so far thought out in advance that he actively treats everyone like actors in a play rather than actual people. To him, this is all just a show being put on, which not only ties into the theme well, but makes him seem that much more devious and out of reach. When I was younger, I didn't really pick up on any of this, but that didn't stop me from finding it extremely easy to empathize with the characters here. Vivi in particular has an amazing journey that he goes on over the course of the game, and he's just such a likable character with incredible writing. That's not to take away from anyone else, as even characters like Freya, Amarant, and Quina get their fair share of growth, without overshadowing the big 4 characters. Everyone has their piece of the puzzle to add, and I don't think the game would work near as well if any one of them was missing. There are moments with each of them that I couldn't imagine the game without. If the first disc of Final Fantasy IX is an adventure in exploring the past and the motivations of the characters, the second disc is an exploration of the world of Gaia itself. We get to see firsthand the extent of the work it's going to take to fix the South Gate. We travel to places like Treno, where the richest of the rich play. We find Gargan Rue, a hidden age-old system that links all of the 4 countries together using giant insects. And we even explore an entirely new continent. Don't get me wrong, there's still tons of stuff we learn about the characters on Disc 2, but much more of it is stuff that they are learning along with us, and the world building is often the thing that guides us toward that character growth. While the first disc felt traditional in its mix of romance, adventure, drama, and the like, the second disc is considerably more lighthearted. In some ways, it's my favorite, because the quirky, silly nature of a lot of the events actually serves to put a darker, more meaningful spin on the drama. In traditional narrative pacing, the viewer or player can often seem more like they're watching story pawns strung along by the plot. It intentionally puts the character under a microscope, where every action they take is meticulously crafted so that it means something to the overall plot. But taking a step back can be an important part of getting people to attach to your characters. When the events are lighthearted and enjoyable filler, it's easier to understand the characters as people. We empathize better with their problems if we feel like we also know them in times where they're just happy to be alive, times devoid of strife. Think about it. We don't only feel close to our closest friends because they stick with us through the tough times. A large part of why we like them so much is also because we share problem-free, fun times together. Laughing with our friends brings us just as close to them as crying with them does. Emulating that by giving the characters things to do that don't relate directly to the plot can help us feel like we're actually friends with these characters in a sense. It's like you're sharing in the events too, rather than just watching from outside of the screen. And then when they get hit hard with something really tough, it's those good times that fuel our want to see them figure things out. Those short stints of levity are really important, and the second disc of 9 is full of them. Kondapiti is probably the most silly and lighthearted section of them all, which is a tribal village sitting upon floating tree roots that's full of dwarves who speak in a vaguely Scottish dialect. These people love to shout "Rally ho!" wherever they go, call the black mages "painty hets," and force our characters to get married in order to continue through the village. These scenes are hilarious, especially if you choose to have Vivi and Quina get married rather than sneaking them through. When Disc 2 does get serious though, boy does it get serious. As a quick side note, it also begins to set up a rather rushed scene later in the game that deals with Zidane coming to terms with who he actually is, but we'll get to that when we get to it. As I was saying, this part of the game hits you hard when it gets dramatic, and leaves you as a player with a lot of questions, some of which transcend the game itself. The first serious chord struck comes right at the beginning of the disc, as the completely peaceful and utterly beautiful civilization of Clara is ravaged by black mages before being blown to pieces by the Eidolon Odin. We as the player are tasked with trying to save as many citizens as we can, and though you indeed do get rewards after the fact, you aren't driven by these gifts. You don't even know these rewards exist until things calm down and it's too late to take back any mistakes you might have made. No, you're driven to save these people because you've gotten to learn about their culture. You've seen the beauty of their little world, and you don't want it to disappear like Burmecia, which you were already too late to save. The chain of events here was written specifically to reinforce the idea that you want to protect these people. You don't want more destruction to happen, because you know the pain it causes. When it comes to the war, Final Fantasy IX may not be as gritty as the real world, not even close, but it handles things in a mature manner, and it doesn't beat around the bush. Whole kingdoms get destroyed without a second thought. No matter how hard you try, you can't save everyone. It makes you feel small, and encourages you to strive to fix things. The second disc also finally confirms the frigid grasp the ice over Bran's heart actually has. As soon as Garnet makes it back to Alexandria, her friends are imprisoned, and she's forced into a ceremony that extracts all the Eidolons from her body. Without a second thought, Bran openly admits, after the ceremony, Garnet is no longer of any use. She orders that her own daughter be executed, and leaves to go cause more destruction with her newly acquired Eidolons. This is a serious wake-up call for Garnet, and it really begins her transformation into a strong woman. It goes without saying that Zidane and company make it just in time to save her, and they make their way to Lindblum. Again, the game pulls no punches as Bran summons a new Eidolon, Automos, who promptly inhales the theater district of Lindblum, while black mages do significant damage elsewhere. What's left is taken over by Alexandria, leaving Regent Cid with little power to help. The group decides to head to an unexplored continent to the north in search of Kuja, and in search of answers. There, Vivi gets his own wake-up call in the form of the Black Mage Village. Apparently, after a certain amount of time, Black Mage soldiers become conscious of their actions. Many of these sentient mages make their escape to the outer continent, where they start their own little town. But slowly, a few of them begin to stop, as the game puts it. Knowing so little about the world, many of the mages anxiously await the time when their friends start back up again, completely oblivious to the truth that death is permanent. Vivi is now faced with the likelihood that he himself might stop at any time. Black mages clearly don't last long, and there's so much Vivi wants to do that he might never get the chance to. Not only is this an extremely powerful theme for a character to grow from, but it's also extremely relevant to all of us. Everyone will die someday. How would any of us react if we were suddenly told that we probably didn't have very long left to live? It's made even more gut-wrenching because Vivi is just a child. He's young, innocent, naive, and all he wants is the best for everyone. He's so endearing that it's extremely painful to watch him struggle with the fact that he's been dealt an unfair hand in life. And still, he spends more time worrying about his mage brethren than he does himself. His true colors show through how he deals with this single revelation, and boy are they vibrant. I think it serves his character well that the game never really says what happens to Vivi. We eventually learn that since he was likely the prototype Black Mage, he'll probably live a bit longer than the others. We also see that he somehow has children, which could imply that he's aging much quicker than a human. We never really get to see whether the other mages eventually stop either. I feel that's the best way they could have ended it. It gives you hope that Vivi may have figured out a way to give his kind a normal lifespan, but it never outright gives him the easy way out, and in turn, it never disrespects all of the growing he had to do. Garnet gets another dose of reality when they meet up with a rambunctious child summoner known as Eiko. She starts to learn where she might have come from, and what actually happened to her birthplace. This is where the game starts to circle back around to the first hour of gameplay. It links the dream she had in the opening cinematic with her ability to summon Eidolons, and the abrupt death of her now apparent stepmother Bran finally closes the book on the direct parallels with the scenes we see Tantalus perform from I Want to Be Your Canary. Though Bran had made some serious mistakes recently, just like King Leo does in the play, Garnet still can't help but love her mother and mourn her loss. Losing Bran utterly tears her up inside, and it's made worse when all the weight of needing to become the new queen begins to press down on her. She's just started her transformation into a woman worthy of the crown. It's still too early for her to have to bear such responsibility, and deep down, she knows it. Disc 3 is where things start to get a bit strange. We got a glimpse in Disc 2 that Kuja wasn't the heart of the problem facing Gaia, but that's fully explored here. There's a new planet we learn about known as Terra. We learn of a man known as Garland who's really pulling the strings. We start to learn about what happened to Madain Suri that left it in ruins, and we learn of an ancient plan to have Gaia assimilated by the nearby planet Terra. Yes, things here get nuts, and to some extent this is where the story starts to lose me a bit. I wouldn't say the direction it takes is wrong, but the way it portrays everything is sort of questionable. Half of the game is very grounded in the world of Gaia and its problems. It felt contained, and the rules of the planet felt consistent. The focus on the war was an interesting one, and I can't help but feeling that all of the questions could have been answered without resorting to using evil space grandpas and strange Zidane clones. As a way to show how the game is sort of restarting and no longer following the lines set out by I Want to Be Your Canary, you once again start this disc as Vivi, walking around doing little side activities in Alexandria. Zidane is once again alone, and Garnet is stuck in the castle, preparing to be queen. I think this is significant, because it's the game's way of showing us that things will be different now. We aren't going to be getting any of those easy answers we've been getting thus far. I believe the early destruction of Alexandria by the Invincible is the finalization of this idea. The core of our experience thus far has been centered around Alexandria's relationship with the rest of the world. And now it's not much more than a pile of rubble. The end of the old Gaia is here, and the world is about to enter a new era. I know I didn't talk about gameplay much at all in the last section, but that's because there wasn't a whole ton to talk about. This game is extraordinarily easy most of the time, as are most JRPGs. It's rare that a JRPG gives you real reasons to use most of its attack options. Almost every battle can be conquered using just attack and cure, and a lot of other choices seem like they're just a waste. Regular battles are just sort of meant to be weak cannon fodder to ensure that you're a high enough level to face the next boss. Honestly, JRPGs, as much as I love them, aren't as strategic as they want you to believe. Most encounters can be overcome with little thought. Final Fantasy IX is even worse in some ways, if you're the type of person who likes to get items early by stealing from bosses. Stealing from bosses is a major pain here. Some items they hold can have a 1 in 256 chance of being stolen, and that's with the bandit skill on. So it's not uncommon to be sitting in a battle for 15 minutes doing nothing but repeatedly trying to pilfer items you're likely to get 4 hours later from a shop. The abilities you can learn from these items are indispensable, but it kind of spoils the fight. I know you might be asking, why does this make battles easier rather than a bigger pain? Well, there are two reasons. First of all, I believe the strength of a lot of the bosses was nerfed in order to ensure that you had time to steal everything. It's not difficult at all to sit there forever trying to steal while keeping your characters fully healed. It feels like bosses intentionally don't do enough damage to scare you into defeating them before their pockets are empty. But the bigger reason is a little mage called Vivi. Vivi is a powerhouse. If you're trying to steal everything, you're simultaneously doing one of two other things. A, you're whittling the boss's health down until they can be defeated with a single hit, once all of their items are finally yours. Or B, you're spamming Vivi's focus command, which raises his magic stat by 25% each time you use it, until it maxes out at 99. Even if his magic stat is incredibly low, some battles are long enough when you're stealing that you can get it to 99 anyway. After that, most bosses go down in 1 or 2 spells. So it's not difficult to stay alive that long, and then you can just one-shot a lot of bosses. Meanwhile, as already explained, normal battles are meant to be extraordinarily easy. Yeah, this game is kinda broken. It's fun, but it's broken. The one thing that helps it along is that every character has a fixed job. Since everyone has a fixed job, you can't always have the optimal team. During Disc 3, there's a point where Kuja forces the team to go to a place known as Oelvert. You can only pick 4 people, and Oelvert has a special property that doesn't allow characters to cast magic. So it's important to use characters who don't rely on spells, meaning your white mages and Vivi are out of the question. This sort of thing can actually challenge the player in interesting ways, especially since if you leave all your mages behind, they'll have to escape Kuja's desert palace without any physical attackers. The game does this a few times during the third disc. It asks you to defeat one of the 4 guardians using Zidane and Quina, and Ibsen's castle requires that you equip your weakest weapons in order to do decent damage. Garnet loses her voice after the shock of Alexandria being destroyed, so a decent chunk of the disc leaves you with a white mage that only sometimes succeeds in taking actions during combat. The point is, the game does some interesting and smart things. It tries to keep combat in a place where you don't end up slipping into autopilot, but if you've played any JRPGs before, it doesn't often succeed. The core of the experience just isn't balanced well enough. Most of the story events that happen during Disc 3, meanwhile, aren't terribly important. You do learn a lot, but the actual things you're doing sort of feel slightly like busy work. You didn't just go to places like Bermesia on Disc 1 because that's where the objective was. You had a personal incentive because you wanted to try and help them fend off the Black Mages and learn more about what's going on. Most of the events in the third disc are more about going to a place to get an item that allows you to go to another place. Along the way, you learn plot pieces, but it feels a bit by the numbers. Still, there are some big events, like the reveal that Zidane is actually a genome created by Garland to cause trouble on Gaia. This is really the first time when Zidane actually struggles with who he is. There was a lot of potential in this part of the game, as in the background it had been building this whole thing up for quite a while. But unfortunately, I think it ends up feeling one-dimensional and melodramatic. Zidane spends so much of his time during the rest of the game being the guy who doesn't have much of a past, and isn't concerned with this fact. He always seems much more concerned with everyone else's problems than with his own. He clearly values his friends more than he values himself, and that shows in his carefree attitude. It's even front and center in his menu screen quote, "You don't need a reason to help people." It seems like his resolve in knowing who he is as a person is impenetrable. But the cracks in his armor start to show subtly when he's doing things like telling Garnet his story in the Black Mage Village Inn, and when he's consoling Vivi in Medain Suri. These parts are great because his issues aren't so apparent that you're expecting the story to suddenly take a turn and center on him. You're just as surprised as he is when it's revealed how big of a part he was intended to play in the events that have transpired. That's sort of the genius in making him the main character, because the way he's written is much more akin to how you would write a sidekick. He's funny, carefree, and is always the one to help those around him who are facing the real issues presented in the story. Until the end, the story doesn't at all center around him, so it's a great idea to suddenly hit him with so much importance. But when it actually comes time to have Zidane respond to the revelations of who he is, it feels incredibly forced. He turns on everyone even though there was never really any incentive to do so, and in less than 5 minutes he's back to normal. It feels like they wanted to do so much more with his growth on Terra, and didn't have the time to. It ends up feeling contrived and superficial. It's ironic that his arc is all about being who you want to be, not who you're expected to be. And then the story shows this by giving us a cliché and expected transformation sequence, rather than one that's natural and organic to his character. So Disc 4. As per usual, this is by far the shortest disc of the game, with only one dungeon left. What's more, there are a lot of areas blocked off by roots of the Yifa tree, which has covered the whole world in mist. I believe that this was partially done for story purposes, but more so, I don't think Square was able to fit every area of the game onto the disc, along with the half an hour worth of cutscenes at the end. Not to mention, they'd have to make mist-covered versions of places like Kondapiti, which would look strange compared to the world map if they were all sunny and bright. Speaking of the world map, one might also notice that the music for it has changed to something a lot more melancholy. As far as the tone of the rest of the story goes on Disc 4, that's pretty spot on. The final section of the narrative is dark and confusing, full of several bosses that were intended to be difficult, and a lot of twists and turns. However, if you're trying to complete as many side quests as possible, everything outside of the story on the 4th disc is anything but gloomy. There's a bunch of items you can nab, including some that require the auction house in Treno. There's Chocobo's Paradise, Magnet Central, frog catching, ultimate weapons to hunt down. Man, the last disc is a blast if you've been keeping up on your side content. First off is the Chocobo stuff. By now, you should at least have the dark blue Chocobo that can cross oceans. Keep going and Choco will eventually transform into a gold and white Chocobo that can fly. The flight itself isn't that great, but the things it gives you access to are awesome. Chocobo's Paradise is an extraordinarily beautiful secret area that's not shown on the map. Make your way there and you can talk to a bunch of Chocobos, grab a bunch of items, finally speak to the King Chocobo in person, and slide down a handful of water slides. But you also now have access to infinite dead peppers, which can really come in handy for finding super secret treasures that aren't marked by chocographs. This includes a nearly complete set of tropical clothing for each of your characters. This equipment doesn't actually offer any benefit at all, with all of its stats being 0. It's nothing more than a nod from the development team in Hawaii that helped work on the game. Seriously, the Chocobo side quest in this is probably my favorite in the entire series. Everything you do in Chocobo Hot and Cold and chocograph hunting is just so rewarding and fun. I love it. In fact, I reached a new all-time high score in Chocobo Hot and Cold while playing through the game for this video, 1,132 points. Woo, that felt good. After that, you can stop by places like Daguerreau to talk to the four-armed man. If you've found enough treasure throughout the game, he'll tell you that his real name is Gilgamesh, and he's not exactly as treasure-savvy as he led you to believe throughout the game. Speaking of names, there's also an extremely convoluted secret in Madain Suri that allows you to find out Garnet's real name, which is Sarah. That's cool, especially if you've gotten your hands on the Naming Way card, because that will then allow you to rename her to Sarah, or Smackledorf, whatever floats your boat. For anyone who's a big fan of Quina, there's the frog catching minigame. Holy crap, is it deep. In order to be as efficient with my hard drive space as possible, I decided to look up some information on how to complete the quest as quickly as I could. I won't go into detail here, but damn, there's a lot that goes into this little minigame. Meanwhile, Mognet Central still needs fixing, in case you've been keeping up on your letters. This disc is where the quest starts to become a little less enjoyable, however, since you have to retread your steps to several different locations around the world to send more letters to more Moogles. The problem is that you only have the name of the Moogle to go off of, so it's up to you to know where that Moogle lives. And as far as tangible items go, you don't get anything worthwhile for completing this quest line. It's fun while you're going through it, though. Even though he's the hardest boss in the game, I think next is when we should bring up Ozma. Based on the lore, it's believed that Ozma was once an Eidolon. The monster is found in an Eidolon cave first of all, but it goes deeper than that. Eidolons take shapes based on legends passed down by humans on Gaia. Without these legends, they have no form. It's believed that Ozma is one such Eidolon, whose legend was forgotten over time, turning it into the swirling mass of colors we see today. Because of its power, humans felt like it was smart to lock it away in the skies, hoping that it would never break free. This fits with the once fate of Leviathan, who was sealed away by the inhabitants of Madain Suri. Ozma is difficult, but it isn't necessarily an unfair fight. Most guides will tell you to be at least level 70 before you face it, and many of them will even tell you that you need to be completely maxed out at 99. That's not really true, however. You can beat the battle even at levels as low as 40 without too much trouble, if you set your characters up properly. It's a battle that's going to require a bit of luck anyway, so it's not worth all the grinding that it would require to get up to levels 70 and above. Speaking of grinding, this game has a rather interesting way of making your characters slightly different each time you play through it. Interestingly enough, the equipment you have on when you level up dictates how your stats will go up, leading to small differences in the short term and larger differences over the course of the game. I don't know if there's a table out there that tells you exactly how each piece of equipment affects each character, but that'd be an interesting thing to see, I think. I once downloaded a file created by a speedrunner in which he had gotten to Memoria in around 8 hours without leveling up any of the characters and while still getting all of the missable treasures. This means it could be used to build a file that was 100% completed and still be able to level up all the characters exactly how you want to. To get that far in 8 hours, that time itself is actually extraordinary to me. Why? Well, most people who've played through Final Fantasy IX will know about the super secret sword you can get your hands on in Memoria. That sword is Excalibur II, which requires getting to a certain area in Memoria in under 12 hours. Unless you're an absolute master at the game, that means skipping basically everything, including cutscenes. Skipping cutscenes requires a PS1, so that you can open the disc tray when the scene starts. Final Fantasy IX has a great system at play that will automatically skip any cutscenes if that part of the disc is unable to read. That eliminates the chance of getting stuck just because your discs get scratched, assuming the parts that hold the gameplay aren't also ruined. Needless to say, it's really damn difficult to get to Memoria in under 12 hours. Technically, you could also allow the timer to roll over a dozen times to get the same effect. Every time the clock reaches 99 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds, it will reset to 0, but it will also change colors. If you let it roll over 12 times, the timer will finally reach its limit and truly reset to 0, making Excalibur II show up if you haven't yet entered the room where you find it. The more you know, I suppose, although you'd have to be mad to wait that long just to get a sword for Steiner. The final side quest worth talking about is getting Cinna's hammer. Cinna loves his hammer, so it's strange that Queen Stella in Treno somehow gets a hold of it. But if you give her all 13 Stellazio coins, she'll hand it over. There are a few things that can be done with this item. First of all, you can create some of the most powerful items through synthesis, using the hammer. but only after you've beaten the hidden boss Hades. Some would say that's a worthy use of the hammer. I would disagree. Another thing you can do is use a few GameShark codes. Certain codes will allow you to equip the hammer to Quina, since I believe they share the same character slot. This will irreversibly change Quina into Cinna, who's extremely weak. Unless you love Cinna, I would avoid this. Funnily enough, it had been so long since I actually tried this that I thought it was a legit feature of the game until this playthrough. I never knew I could only do it because of the GameShark codes I'd had on at the time. Anyway, the third thing you can do with the hammer is keep it. Yes, if you keep the hammer, it actually adds several minutes worth of scenes to the ending of the game. I'd say this is the most worthwhile use of the hammer, since you definitely won't need Cinna or any of the possible synthesis items for anything after you've beaten Ozma. You won't even need them for beating Ozma. There's one more thing I want to briefly touch on before I move to the story presented on Disc 4. That thing is the music of Final Fantasy IX. I love this music. It's not exactly a controversial statement, with Nobuo Uematsu being widely considered one of the most technically skilled and artistically creative composers in video games, and I can't say that I disagree either. His work is probably the biggest influence on me as far as music goes. There's such a variety in his work, while still having a central style. What's more, he really understands how to create a cohesive theme for a score, without sounding repetitive, and his work on Final Fantasy IX is no exception. Every piece of music in this game fits the moment it's played in. Every piece is unique, and stirs the exact emotions that the scene intends to stir. There's a very clear understanding of where to make things big and complex, and where to dial it back to a very simple melody. I really wish I could have used the soundtrack as the background music for this video, because it would have helped explain my point here, but I can't, and as such I can't really say much more about it. This soundtrack is really just one that needs to be experienced. Now, that ending. Unfortunately, this is the biggest mistake the game makes. It's inconsistent, out of nowhere, and feels like padding. Don't get me wrong, I like everything after the final boss, but that final boss is a big issue. Let me ask, why isn't Kuja the final boss? Why is this character that we've been chasing for 40 hours not the ultimate enemy? Why is he so dang easy? Actually, let me back up for a second. In case you didn't quite understand what was going on, after blowing up Terra, Kuja went to search for a way to destroy Gaia. Even though he clearly has the power to just blow it up like he did Terra, he wants the end result to be a little cleaner, I suppose. He ends up finding what he's looking for in the form of a crystal. This crystal is briefly brought up in one offhand remark during the game, and then is shoved in your face through confusing flavor text all the way through Memoria. It's nowhere else to be seen in the entire game. This crystal controls all existence. Destroy it, and nothing exists. Technically, it's worth noting that there are other crystals as well. During your journey through Memoria, the party sees different memories replay themselves. These are being replayed by Gaia's crystal. Why Kuja doesn't just destroy that crystal, I don't know. But regardless, Kuja makes his way all the way through Memoria to the Crystal World, which is technically the beginning of everything, where time doesn't move. When you make it to him, you waste him easily, before he decides to use Ultima as a last-ditch effort to kill everything. He fails, and instead awakens the true final boss, Necron. Necron is... I don't know what Necron is. He's not given any real context or background. He just sort of shows up because Kuja's strife awakened him. It would be interesting if Necron was an Eidolon given power through all the legends and memories that exist within Gaia's crystal, or even the ultimate crystal, but he's not. He's just an out-of-nowhere monster that believes that all living things cause too much pain, so all life must be eradicated to fix the problem. Necron wants to destroy the crystal too. This is not a very good way to end the game. There's no point to Necron other than making a really tough boss fight for the player. I struggle with the whole Terra assimilation thing with Garland to begin with, but to suddenly decide, yo bro, there's a magical crystal that controls everything, and a random deity that wakes up to destroy it and reset the universe. That's just silly. Kuja already wanted to destroy the crystal, so why introduce yet another character in the last 10 minutes who has the same goal? Why couldn't they have at least worked together or something? I have a feeling that this whole thing was intended to be a much bigger part of the narrative. After all, the crystal is the symbol of the game, even though it doesn't show up until the last 15 minutes. I just think the team ran out of time. It's a shame because the first 2/3 of the game is absolutely fantastic. I wouldn't say that this is a complete failure, but it's easily one of the weakest endings in the series. Just give Kuja 2 more forms and make it so that he's just gathering enough energy to destroy the universe or something. There's no need for all of this Necron, crystal destruction mumbo-jumbo. At least the post-boss ending is satisfying. That, and you can play blackjack for some reason if you input a code on the end screen. That's kind of fun. In the end, Final Fantasy IX is still a fantastic game, despite its problems. You know that feeling you can recall from the first time you experienced something you really love? I've played through this game at least 24 times, and it doesn't matter how many times I play it, I still get that feeling. I can't say that about more than a handful of things. There are so many little touches hidden throughout it. There's so much passion clearly put into it. Most of the big players like Sakaguchi and Uematsu have stated that they feel it was their best work in the series. I think that's worth something, and there's so much left unsaid that players can really sink their teeth into as well. The game doesn't try and make sure you know absolutely every piece of information. It's content simply letting flavor, context, and some world-building material slip by people. I like that. There's also the side quest that was only just found a few years ago by Garland the Great from YouTube. The point is that they didn't force anything on the player that they didn't need to. Things like Gargants likely being used by the Alexandrians that left for Maiden Cerie are never outright said, but once you know where the summoners came from, you can make the link yourself. One can even deduce that maybe Gargants were originally found while excavating Fossil Rue, bred for use in Gargan Rue, and that's what gave the summoners the idea that there might have been a way to another continent through those tunnels to begin with. It's that kind of subtlety and depth that isn't often put into games unless it's shoved in your face. Square was completely okay with hiding details like this everywhere, full well knowing that the vast majority of people wouldn't find them. Heck, even the ending technically makes sense and is given proper context. It just needed more of said context to be pushed to the forefront, and much more time to breathe. When one is trying to create a traditional hands-on, flowing narrative that guides the player along, it's of the utmost importance that all of the basic pieces are given their due. You can't hide vital bits to understand the ending of the story in subtext and side narrative. But I digress. The point is, there's just so much to this game that's worth experiencing, and boy am I glad that I did.